Today, a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of the United States has fundamentally reshaped the debate over trade, presidential authority, and U.S. economic strategy. The court ruled against the sweeping global tariffs imposed under the administration of Donald Trump, declaring that the executive branch exceeded its constitutional authority by implementing broad import taxes without clear congressional authorization. This decision has far-reaching implications not just for the Trump administration's economic policies, but for the U.S. trade system, global markets, and the balance of power between the presidency and Congress. To understand the significance of this ruling, it's important to start with some context. During his presidency, Trump adopted an aggressive trade strategy, commonly referred to as America First, which relied heavily on tariffs as a tool to protect domestic industries, encourage local manufacturing, and pressure other nations into renegotiating trade deals. Among the most notable targets of these tariffs were countries that the administration argued had engaged in unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, or excessive market advantages over American producers. Key sectors affected included steel and aluminum, industrial machinery, automotive parts, agricultural products, and consumer electronics. Tariffs are, in essence, taxes on imported goods. They are designed to make foreign products more expensive, theoretically encouraging consumers to buy domestic alternatives. From an economic standpoint, tariffs can help certain industries survive competitive pressures and protect jobs. They also give governments leverage in trade negotiations. However, tariffs come at a cost. They increase prices for consumers, can trigger retaliatory measures from other countries, and often create inefficiencies in the supply chain. For businesses that rely on imported raw materials or components, tariffs raise production costs and can make U.S. exports less competitive abroad. The Supreme Court ruling directly challenges the manner in which Trump's administration implemented these tariffs. According to the court, while presidents can exercise limited trade powers under specific statutory or emergency provisions, the broad global measures put in place exceeded the authority granted by Congress. At the heart of the decision is the principle that the Constitution vests the power to regulate trade primarily in the legislative branch. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the authority to levy taxes, regulate commerce among the states, and control tariffs on imports. While the executive branch can act under narrowly defined circumstances, such as a national emergency or specific congressional authorization, the court determined that sweeping tariffs affecting dozens of countries and hundreds of industries fall outside the scope of presidential authority. This ruling represents more than a technical legal correction. It is a profound assertion of the separation of powers in the U.S. government. By limiting the president's unilateral ability to impose tariffs, the court is ensuring that major economic policy decisions, particularly those with global repercussions, remain subject to legislative oversight. In doing so, the decision safeguards the principle that the presidency cannot unilaterally reshape international trade and economic policy without accountability to Congress and, by extension, the American people. The implications for the U.S. economy are both immediate and long-term. On the one hand, limiting these tariffs is likely to lower the cost of imported goods for consumers. Electronics, automobiles, household items, and industrial inputs that had previously been taxed at high rates may now become more affordable. This could reduce inflationary pressures, stabilize consumer prices, and improve purchasing power for American families. Businesses, especially those relying on imported raw materials and intermediate goods, could see lower production costs, potentially leading to increased competitiveness, higher profit margins, and expanded output. Lower tariffs may also ease tensions in supply chains that have been disrupted over the past several years due to trade wars and retaliatory measures by foreign governments. On the other hand, industries that had been protected by Trump's tariffs, such as steel, aluminum, and certain manufacturing sectors, may now face intensified competition from abroad. Domestic producers that benefited from the artificial price advantage of tariffs could experience reduced demand for their products or be forced to innovate and reduce costs to remain competitive. This dynamic could influence employment in certain sectors and may prompt calls for new forms of protection, subsidies, or legislative measures to safeguard domestic industry. Essentially, while consumers and global markets may benefit, there will inevitably be economic winners and losers from this decision. From a global perspective, the Supreme Court's ruling could have a stabilizing effect on international trade relations. Many trading partners had expressed concern over the Trump tariffs, citing unfair trade practices, potential retaliation, and disruptions to international supply chains. By rolling back these measures, or at least curtailing the president's ability to impose broad tariffs unilaterally, the ruling could ease tensions with major trading partners, including China, the European Union, and Canada. This may pave the way for more predictable trade negotiations and reduce the risk of trade wars that have historically harmed global economic growth. Politically, the decision is likely to reignite debate over the role of tariffs and the appropriate use of presidential authority in economic policymaking. Supporters of Trump's trade strategy argue that tariffs were essential to protect American jobs, counter unfair foreign practices, and secure better trade deals. Critics, however, contend that the tariffs were economically damaging, raised consumer prices, and triggered retaliation that hurt American exporters. The Supreme Court ruling now provides a clear legal framework that any future administration must consider when pursuing aggressive trade policies. Presidents will no longer be able to rely on unilateral executive action to impose tariffs on a massive scale. Legislative approval or narrowly defined statutory authority will be required. This ruling also sends a message about the role of the judiciary in balancing the powers of government. While courts rarely intervene in economic policy decisions, this case demonstrates that when executive actions have broad economic and constitutional implications, judicial review serves as a critical check on potential overreach. Legal experts are already calling this decision one of the most consequential in recent history regarding the separation of powers in economic policy. It clarifies the boundaries of executive authority and sets a precedent that will influence how future presidents approach trade and economic strategy. In addition to economic and legal considerations, the Supreme Court ruling carries symbolic weight. It underscores the principle that major policy initiatives with nationwide impact must be transparent, accountable, and grounded in the Constitution. The decision reminds both policymakers and the public that the American system of checks and balances is not merely theoretical. It actively shapes how critical decisions about commerce, international relations, and national economic strategy are made. As this story develops, there are several areas to watch closely. Congress may choose to pass new legislation that clarifies or expands presidential trade authority, potentially reshaping the boundaries set by this ruling. Domestic industries affected by the rollback of tariffs may lobby for targeted protection, subsidies, or incentives to maintain competitiveness. International partners may respond with adjustments of their own, reflecting the complex interdependence of global trade. Finally, the broader political implications for the Trump administration and future presidents are significant, as this decision constrains one of the most powerful tools in modern economic policymaking and reshapes the dialogue around trade, national security, and executive power. In summary, the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Trump's global tariffs is a historic moment with wide-ranging consequences. It is not only about tariffs or economics, it is about constitutional authority, the balance of powers, and the long-term direction of U.S. trade policy. Consumers, businesses, lawmakers, and global partners all have a stake in understanding what this ruling means and how it will shape the next chapter of American economic and political life. By limiting unilateral presidential action in this domain, the court has established clear guardrails for the future, ensuring that the rules governing trade remain accountable, transparent, and grounded in law. The coming months will reveal how Congress, the administration, and global markets respond, but one thing is clear. This is a defining moment in the history of American economic governance, with ramifications that will be felt for years to come. The ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States striking down the global tariffs imposed under Donald Trump is as much about constitutional law as it is about trade policy. While many media reports have focused on the economic implications of removing these tariffs, understanding the court's reasoning requires a closer look at the separation of powers, statutory interpretation, and the limits of executive authority. At the core of the case is the question, who has the ultimate authority to control tariffs in the United States? According to Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the explicit power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, and establish tariffs on imports. This allocation of authority was designed to prevent unilateral action by the executive branch in matters that affect the nation's economy, trade relationships, and revenue. By assigning trade powers to Congress, the framers ensured that decisions with broad national and international consequences would be debated and approved by representatives accountable to the electorate. The Trump administration argued that the president had authority under a combination of statutes, including national security provisions and emergency trade powers, to impose broad tariffs on imported goods from multiple countries. These statutes allow the executive to act quickly to protect American economic interests in certain circumstances, particularly where national security is implicated or where immediate economic threats exist. However, the court found that the scope of Trump's tariffs far exceeded what these statutes were intended to authorize. While emergency provisions are designed for narrowly targeted short-term measures, the tariffs in question were global, long-term, and affected hundreds of industries, creating systemic changes in trade policy without explicit legislative approval. The justices emphasized that the Constitution requires a balance of power between branches of government. By taking unilateral action to impose global tariffs, the court argued, the executive branch was essentially assuming a power reserved for Congress, the ability to regulate commerce and generate revenue through tariffs. This overreach, the court concluded, violated the fundamental separation of powers. In the words of the majority opinion, allowing a president to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization would shift the balance of economic power from the legislature to the executive, undermining the constitutional design and threatening the system of checks and balances. Another key aspect of the ruling involves the interpretation of statutory authority. The court examined whether the laws cited by the Trump administration, including emergency trade powers under the Trade Expansion Act and national security provisions under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, could legally justify broad, sustained tariffs. The court concluded that these statutes were intended for specific, limited situations, not for permanent restructuring of international trade or global protectionist measures. By applying them to impose tariffs on dozens of countries across multiple sectors, the administration exceeded the scope envisioned by Congress. In legal terms, this is referred to as an ultra vires action, an act beyond the legal power or authority of the branch performing it. The ruling also addressed the balance between executive discretion and legislative oversight. While presidents have broad discretion in implementing foreign policy and certain economic measures, that discretion is not unlimited. When actions directly affect domestic economic structures, international trade relations, and national revenue, Congress retains ultimate authority. The court stressed that bypassing Congress in these areas not only violates statutory limits, but also undermines democratic accountability, as elected lawmakers are the representatives responsible for overseeing fiscal and trade policy. The justices acknowledged that national security concerns can sometimes justify emergency tariffs, but they were careful to define the boundaries. A national security threat, they argued, must be direct, specific, and clearly linked to the measure taken. Broad economic protectionism, or the desire to strengthen domestic industries, while politically significant, does not meet this threshold. By imposing global tariffs under the guise of national security without clear, demonstrable threats, the Trump administration blurred the line between legitimate emergency action and general economic policy, a distinction the court found critical. The decision also sets a precedent regarding future executive trade actions. Presidents cannot assume sweeping unilateral power to impose tariffs simply by citing vague national security or emergency provisions. Any significant trade action affecting large swaths of the economy or numerous countries will require explicit congressional approval. This creates a new framework for how future administrations will approach trade policy. It reinforces the principle that while presidents may act quickly in emergencies, long-term and wide-ranging economic measures remain under legislative control. From a broader perspective, the ruling highlights the role of the judiciary in checking executive overreach. While courts are generally reluctant to intervene in matters of trade or foreign policy, this case demonstrates that the judiciary has a responsibility to ensure that executive actions comply with both statutory authority and constitutional principles. Legal scholars are noting that this decision is one of the most significant affirmations of congressional supremacy over trade policy in decades. It clarifies that the presidency cannot operate in a vacuum when taking actions with broad economic, political, and international consequences. Politically, this ruling may shift the debate over trade and tariffs in the United States. Supporters of tariffs may argue that Congress should pass new legislation, giving the president more explicit authority to act quickly in trade disputes. Critics will see the decision as a validation of concerns that executive overreach can destabilize markets, raise consumer costs, and undermine international trust. Either way, the ruling sends a clear signal that the law is a critical constraint on policy, regardless of political ideology or economic strategy. The ruling also has important international implications. Many trading partners, including the European Union, China, Canada, and Mexico, had expressed concern over Trump's tariffs, some of which provoked retaliatory measures. By limiting the ability of the executive branch to impose sweeping tariffs, the court indirectly signals to international markets that U.S. trade policy must follow legal and constitutional procedures, reducing uncertainty and potential conflict. Countries negotiating with the United States can now be more confident that sudden unilateral tariffs are less likely, which may improve the climate for diplomatic negotiations and long-term trade agreements. In conclusion, the Supreme Court's decision to block Trump's global tariffs is a landmark affirmation of constitutional governance. It is about more than just economic policy. It is about the separation of powers, statutory interpretation, and democratic accountability. The ruling establishes that the president cannot unilaterally restructure international trade without clear legislative authorization, limits the use of national security as a justification for broad economic measures, and clarifies the legal boundaries of executive authority in matters with significant domestic and international impact. The economic consequences are profound, but the constitutional message is even more significant. The rule of law, checks and balances, and congressional oversight remain central to U.S. governance, ensuring that trade policy, like all major policy areas, is accountable, transparent, and constitutionally grounded. This legal reasoning lays the foundation for the next part of our analysis, where we will explore the economic consequences of the ruling, who wins, who loses, and how it will affect American consumers, industries, and global trade relations in both the short and long term. With the Supreme Court of the United States striking down the broad global tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, the immediate question for many Americans, businesses, and international partners is, what happens now? The decision has far-reaching implications across economic sectors, trade relationships, and the political landscape, and understanding these consequences is critical for assessing both short-term adjustments and long-term trends. 1. Economic impact, winners and losers. At the core of the ruling is the removal of additional costs on imported goods. For consumers, this is generally positive. Products such as electronics, automobiles, household appliances, industrial equipment, and raw materials may see lower prices, easing inflationary pressures in a period when families are already dealing with rising costs. Cheaper imports can also stimulate consumer spending, which drives economic growth, benefiting sectors like retail, logistics, and manufacturing that rely on global supply chains. Businesses that rely on imported raw materials and intermediate components stand to gain significantly. Industries such as automotive manufacturing, machinery production, and technology assembly often pay tariffs on metals, components, and finished parts. Removing these tariffs reduces production costs, increases profit margins, and allows for more competitive pricing, both domestically and internationally. Companies that had struggled to adapt to increased input costs over the past few years now have an opportunity to stabilize operations, expand output, and potentially hire more workers. However, not all sectors will benefit. Domestic industries that were previously protected by the tariffs, such as steel, aluminum, heavy manufacturing, and certain agricultural sectors, may face stronger competition from foreign producers offering cheaper goods. These industries may experience reduced demand, margin compression, or even layoffs if they cannot adjust production efficiency or differentiate products. In political terms, this creates tension between consumer-friendly economic policy and the protection of strategic domestic industries. From a macroeconomic perspective, global markets are likely to respond favorably. Many countries had threatened retaliatory tariffs in response to Trump's measures, particularly in China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. The Supreme Court ruling reduces the likelihood of sudden sweeping U.S. tariffs, which may stabilize trade negotiations, strengthen investor confidence, and improve international relations. Export-oriented U.S. businesses may also benefit from reduced retaliatory measures, expanding opportunities for trade and foreign investment. 2. Political and legislative consequences. The ruling has major political ramifications within the United States. Supporters of Trump's America First approach may view the decision as a limitation on presidential power that hampers the ability to protect domestic jobs and industries. They could push Congress to pass new legislation granting more explicit authority for targeted tariffs or protectionist measures. Critics, on the other hand, see the ruling as a vindication of concerns about executive overreach, confirming that unilateral trade policies can have harmful economic and legal consequences. For Congress, this decision underscores its central role in trade and economic policy. Lawmakers now have both the power and the responsibility to define the parameters under which future administrations can impose tariffs or take emergency trade actions. The ruling may spur new legislation that balances national security, economic competitiveness, and international obligations while limiting the scope for unilateral presidential action. Politically, the ruling also influences public perception of presidential authority. Future presidents will face clearer legal limits on using tariffs as a tool for economic or diplomatic leverage. This may change campaign narratives, policy priorities, and the strategies of both parties when addressing trade and domestic industrial policy. 3. Global trade and international relations. Internationally, the decision sends a strong signal that U.S. trade policy must follow legal and constitutional processes. Trading partners who have expressed frustration over abrupt tariffs, market disruption, and retaliatory measures will likely welcome the increased predictability. Countries such as China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico may respond positively, creating a more stable environment for negotiations, trade deals, and multinational cooperation. Global supply chains, disrupted over the past several years due to trade uncertainty, could stabilize. Industries that rely on imported components, such as automotive assembly or electronics manufacturing, may benefit from reduced logistical disruptions and lower production costs. Multinational companies may reassess investment strategies, rebalancing production to take advantage of a more predictable U.S. trade environment. 4. Strategic implications for U.S. economic policy. Beyond immediate economic impacts, the ruling shapes the long-term strategy of U.S. trade policy. It emphasizes that while presidents can act swiftly in emergencies, long-term measures with wide-reaching economic impact require legislative involvement. This creates a more stable framework for businesses, investors, and international partners, while simultaneously reinforcing the separation of powers established in the Constitution. Additionally, the decision will likely influence the use of tariffs as a tool in future negotiations. Economic strategists will need to consider both legal constraints and the political cost of unilateral measures. The ruling essentially establishes that any future attempt to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval could be challenged successfully in court, creating a legal precedent that will shape trade policy for decades. 5. Social and domestic implications. Consumers, small businesses, and workers across multiple sectors will feel the effects differently. Lower import costs may reduce living expenses and increase purchasing power. Conversely, workers in industries previously protected by tariffs may face uncertainty, layoffs, or pressure to adapt to increased foreign competition. Lawmakers, advocacy groups, and trade associations will likely engage in debates over balancing consumer benefits, domestic employment, and national competitiveness. This ruling also serves as a cautionary tale about the complexity of using tariffs as a political or economic tool. While they can serve strategic purposes, the risks of overreach, legal challenges, and international retaliation are significant. Policymakers must weigh the economic and social costs alongside the intended protective benefits, recognizing that unilateral action in trade can have ripple effects far beyond domestic borders. 6. Conclusion: a historic moment with lasting implications. The Supreme Court's decision to block Trump's global tariffs is historic not only for its immediate economic effects, but also for its constitutional and political significance. It clarifies the limits of executive power, reinforces congressional authority over trade, and signals to both domestic and international audiences that major economic decisions require accountability and legal grounding. Economically, the ruling may lower consumer prices, reduce inflationary pressures, stabilize supply chains, and improve relations with trading partners. Politically, it limits presidential authority, reinforces the separation of powers, and prompts Congress to take a more active role in trade policy. Globally, it may ease tensions, reduce the risk of retaliatory tariffs, and create a more predictable environment for international commerce. Ultimately, this decision is a defining moment in U.S. governance, where law, economics, and politics intersect. It underscores that major policy measures, especially those affecting millions of Americans and hundreds of industries, cannot bypass constitutional limits. The ruling will shape the landscape of U.S. trade, presidential authority, and international relations for years to come, making it one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in recent memory. As analysts, economists, and political observers continue to debate the full impact, one thing is clear. The era of unilateral executive tariffs on a global scale has been legally constrained, and the balance of power between the president and Congress in shaping U.S. trade policy has been firmly reinforced.